Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the guest room door, once prepared for her grandchildren, now quietly locked. The silence had grown thick over the past month, layering itself over the once bustling house like the snow blanketing the Michigan street outside. Since Gerald's funeral, even the floorboards seemed quieter, as if they too were mourning. The holiday decorations were still in the storage closet, untouched, unmentioned. The kitchen clock ticked on steadily, its rhythm oddly loud now in the stillness. She moved slowly across the hallway, trailing her fingers along the smooth banister. The guest room door stood closed, no faint music or playful footsteps on the other side. Noah used to keep his toy trains in there. She remembered the way he would beg for one more bedtime story curled up under the blanket she had knit for him when he was born. Now not even his socks were left in the laundry. Downstairs, the hum of the dishwasher had stopped. Margaret descended the stairs carefully, holding onto the rail, her eyes drifting to the living room where Ethan stood near the fireplace. He looked up as she entered, polite smile, stiff posture. "You've done enough, Mum," he said gently, gesturing toward the armchair she usually occupied. "Maybe now's the time to think about peace and rest." He didn't say it unkindly. That in a way made it harder to respond. His words were wrapped in consideration, as if cloaked in velvet, soft but final. Margaret blinked at him, unsure of what to say. Behind him, Layla stood with her phone in hand, her eyes barely lifting. "We've found a place," Layla said, her voice neutral. "It's not far. It's comfortable. You'll have your own space. Someone will be there to help cook, clean, everything." Margaret turned her head slightly, not in protest, but to buy herself time. There was no question in the air. No one had asked what she wanted. The conversation was already past that point. She recognized the pattern, polite wording, wrapped decisions, as if she'd agreed by staying silent long enough. Later that evening, after a dinner that barely held any taste, she sat in the kitchen alone. The folded paper on the table had a neatly printed address. Whispering Pines Senior Residence. It sounded like a retreat, a pleasant exile. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. It would wait. They would wait. She was being given the time to absorb what had already been arranged. Upstairs, the hallway was dark, the only light spilling from the night lamp she kept in her room. Margaret closed the door behind her with a soft click and paused. The sound that followed wasn't immediate, but distinct, the soft grind of a latch. Her doorknob no longer turned freely, locked, from the outside. She sat back on the edge of her bed, not panicked, not even surprised. Just confirmed. It was a signal, perhaps not even meant as a punishment, perhaps just precaution, they would say. But it was no longer her home. Not truly. Not since the day the house got colder. She reached for the drawer in her nightstand, hands steady. From within it, she pulled a small, worn leather notebook. The edges curled from age, and the faint scent of cedar still clung to the binding. She hadn't opened it in years. It had once held recipes, then notes about her garden. Now she opened it to a fresh page. With slow, deliberate pen strokes, Margaret wrote 2 words, "Watch carefully." And then she closed the book, set it beside her lamp, and turned off the light. The first snowfall had settled on the backyard roses, untouched, undisturbed, and forgotten. From her seat by the kitchen window, Margaret stared out at the garden. The white blanket outside was flawless, smooth. No footprints, no signs of life. Just the soft curve of the buried flower beds, the skeletal lines of dormant rosebushes pressing against the trellis. Gerald used to rake this patch, and she had once pruned each stem with quiet devotion. Now the glass door that led outside shimmered with morning frost and didn't budge when she tried to slide it open. She tried again. Nothing. The lock didn't click, because it was already in place, from the inside. She stood still, one hand pressed against the pane. Cold seeped through her skin, but it wasn't the kind of cold that prompted you to shiver. It was the kind that stilled you, held you in place. She traced the condensation forming at the edge of the frame. Somewhere in her chest, something small and sharp settled. Layla appeared behind her voice, soft and practiced. "It's for your safety, Margaret. The steps get icy this time of year. We didn't want you slipping." She turned slowly, meeting her daughter-in-law's carefully measured expression. There was no warmth in it, no cruelty either, just efficiency. "The snow's fresh," Margaret replied. "No one's stepped out." Layla smiled briefly, like acknowledging a well-behaved child. "Let's keep it that way." Later, while Layla was in the other room, her footsteps light her presence, always just on the edge of the air, Margaret's phone buzzed. She hadn't heard from Julia in a while. The message was short. "Just checking in. You still writing?" She stared at the words. Julia had been her lawyer once. Now they exchanged rare texts, most of them polite and vague. But this one landed differently. Writing. That had once meant recipes, letters, lists. Now it meant watching. She went upstairs, moving with care. The notebook was still there beside the lamp, undisturbed. She opened it slowly, smoothing out the pages. This time she didn't write words. Instead, she began a sketch, the floor plan of the house. She didn't have a ruler, but she remembered every corner, every hallway, every place where she used to walk freely. She circled the hallway corner near the staircase where a small black dot had appeared last week. It was almost imperceptible, but she knew what it was. A camera. She circled 2 more locations, adding faint arrows. She paused, staring at the living room. That one didn't have a dot, not yet. The notebook stayed open as she sat beside it, tracing her fingertip over each page. Her heart wasn't racing, but it was beating differently, not in fear, but in alertness. At lunch, Layla brought her a tray: chicken soup, crackers, coffee in the old blue mug that used to be part of a matching set. Margaret accepted it quietly, hands steady. Layla lingered longer than usual, pretending to adjust the folded napkin on the tray. "Ethan said we'll have more space soon," she said, eyes fixed on the spoon. "Once things are finalized?" Margaret said nothing. She only watched the way Layla pressed the spoon into the soup and then stopped halfway. After she left, Margaret sat with the tray in her lap. The soup cooled quickly in the air. She picked up the coffee cup, turned it in her hands. The glaze was chipped at the base, a familiar chip from a year ago. It had always been hers. She looked into the dark surface as if it might reflect something back. It didn't. She whispered, barely louder than breath. "They've started measuring." The car was warm, but Margaret wore her coat like armor. She sat upright, seatbelt, fastened tightly across her chest, hands folded over her lap. The wool of her coat scratched lightly at her neck, but she didn't adjust it. The morning sun filtered through the car windows, catching the shimmer of fresh snow piled on every rooftop. Outside, the world looked soft, a pristine white stage, masking what lay beneath. Ethan drove with one hand on the steering wheel, the other occasionally tapping the dashboard to the beat of a song she didn't recognize. He smiled every now and then, casting glances toward her. "It's a nice drive," he said. "They say the trees look like lace in the winter. You know, like in those holiday postcards Dad used to love." Margaret offered a faint smile. She looked out the window, tracking the rhythm of telephone poles passing by. "We'll check everything, of course. If it's not right, we'll look elsewhere. You deserve the best." His voice carried the same tone Layla had once used back when this was only a consideration wrapped neatly in care. Margaret didn't respond. Her hand rested gently on her leather notebook inside her purse. She felt its edge beneath her fingers, its quiet weight, steadying her. As they turned off the main road, a new structure emerged, Sunset Glen. The sign at the gate was carved in stone gold lettering, nestled against trimmed hedges. The building itself was impressive, tall windows, quiet fountains, manicured paths still visible beneath shoveled snow. It looked more like a private retreat than a nursing home. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and floor polish. A woman in a pale blue blouse stepped forward with practiced warmth. "Welcome, Mrs. Alden," she said, her voice a mix of cheer and efficiency. "I'm Diane. We're so happy to have you here." Margaret nodded politely. Her eyes scanned the foyer ceiling cameras near the corners, smooth marble tiles underfoot, a fireplace crackling silently in the lounge. "Let me show you your suite." Diane continued leading the way down a wide hallway lined with framed nature prints. "This is one of our best ensuite bath garden facing window-heated flooring. There's a call button here and of course, full monitoring, just for safety." The room was clean. Too clean. Not a crease on the bedding, not a single misplaced fibre on the carpet. Margaret stepped inside slowly, her boots leaving faint wet spots on the floor. Diane opened a cabinet, pointing out emergency supplies. "And access is restricted, of course. Only staff with proper clearance have keys." Margaret turned. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "Do you know who specifically?" Diane blinked. "Oh, well, our head of care and 2 assistants. But we never enter without notice?" "Of course," Margaret said, her tone neutral. But her eyes lingered not on the woman, but on the lock. Back in the foyer, Ethan waited with a small paper bag in hand. "Your favorite granola bars," he said with a smile. "And those peppermint teas you like." "I labeled them." He leaned in for a kiss on the cheek. Margaret allowed it. "We'll check in on weekends. You rest now, okay?" She didn't reply. She only held her purse, both hands gripping the leather notebook inside. He seemed not to notice, or perhaps chose not to. A few minutes later, his car disappeared down the curved driveway. Margaret returned to the room alone. The hallway was silent, save for the faint buzz of overhead lights. She stepped inside, closed the door, and turned the deadbolt from the inside with a gentle click. She stood there for a moment, then took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the hallway wall, turned, walked back to the bed, then again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause. She began to count. There were curtains, but Margaret noticed they'd been nailed to the wall. Not just tucked in neatly, but affixed one edge, stapled where the fabric met the drywall, the other corner flattened and pinned with brass tacks that caught the light. She reached up gently, testing the fabric. It shifted slightly, but would not pull back. Behind it, the window was there. She could feel the cold press of glass, but the view was reduced to blurred light and shadow through a thin cotton veil. She sat down, coat-still buttoned notebook open on her lap. Outside, the wind rattled faintly against the seams of the building. It found its way through the smallest cracks in the door, brushing against her ankles like something half-remembered. She stood and crossed the room again. The window latch didn't move, locked, possibly painted shut. She listened carefully. No one in the hallway. She opened the door slowly and stepped out. The corridor was long carpeted, lined with framed photographs of autumn trees and smiling seniors on garden benches. But the air was too still. No television. No quiet murmurs of conversation. Just soft shoe sounds and the distant rattle of a lunch cart. She walked slowly past the elevator, past 2 closed doors, then heard footsteps behind her. "Oh, Margaret," a nurse called gently. "Do you need help getting back?" The woman wore a pink cardigan over her uniform, her ID badge swinging softly. Margaret turned, offering a mild smile. "Just walking." "It's easy to get turned around," the nurse said. "Most of our residents prefer resting until lunch." Margaret said nothing. The nurse didn't step closer, just stood waiting like a boundary with a smile. At lunch, the dining room held 6 other residents, scattered among neatly set tables. The room smelled of steamed vegetables and lemon disinfectant. Margaret sat alone until a slow-moving man took the seat across from her. "Do you mind?" he asked, voice dry with age. "Not at all." They ate in silence for a few minutes. He broke a bread roll carefully, hands trembling slightly. Then, without looking at her, he asked, "Did your son bring you here too?" She paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Yes." He nodded once, chewing slowly. "Mine cried when he left. That was 3 years ago." Margaret said nothing, but she looked at his eyes and saw they were dry. That afternoon she returned to her room. With the door closed and her back to it, she opened her notebook again. The floor plan was expanding. Today she added 2 corners of the second-floor hallway, where she'd seen a nurse disappear behind a keypad door. She marked the clock above the elevator. Shift change, 11:03:07:00. Quiet between them. Someone knocked gently, then entered without waiting. Diane stood holding a paper in her hand and a rehearsed smile. "This came from your son," she said lightly. "Just a small prescription, nothing serious. A mild sleeping pill. To help you adjust." Margaret looked at the paper without touching it. "He asked that we have it ready for you in the evenings," Diane added. "Just if you need it." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice even. Diane nodded and left. Later, when the hallway lights dimmed to their evening glow, Margaret took out the paper. She stared at it, then calmly crossed a single black line through the entire request. She smoothed the page, placed the paper in the center of her notebook, then flipped past it to the next page. There, written in her steady hand, but never mailed, was a letter that began, "To Julia." She paused, pen hovering above the next line. Then she closed the notebook slowly, deliberately, and tucked it beneath her pillow. The mug was warm, but Margaret knew it hadn't been filled with coffee. She held it gently, its weight, familiar, the ceramic smooth beneath her fingers. The surface was dry, not a trace of steam. She tilted it slightly, pretending to sip, as she looked out at the overcast morning, pressing against the wide dining room windows. In the corner, soft classical music played, something string-heavy and polite, like wallpaper for the ears. No one noticed she hadn't drunk. Across the room, Ms. Diane moved from one resident to the next, her voice wrapped in warmth and routine. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Mrs. John, how's your ankle today? Always smiling, always moving forward." When she passed Margaret, she simply nodded. Margaret set the cup down gently, then picked up her fork. She ate the eggs, left the toast. That evening, the bread was buttered lightly, just the way she used to like it. She stared at it for a moment, then pushed the plate slightly away. Diane appeared almost instantly. "Everything okay with your appetite?" Her voice still gentle, but her eyes searched deeper than usual. "I'm not very hungry tonight," Margaret replied. "Oh," Diane said, pausing. "If there's anything you'd like differently, do let us know." Margaret smiled faintly. "Thank you." After dinner, she walked slowly to the common lounge. 2 bookshelves. A fake fireplace screen, glowing orange. She sat on the couch farthest from the door and retrieved her phone from her pocket. No one else was around, at least visibly. She dialed. The phone rang twice. Julia Hayes came, the voice sharp-clipped but familiar. "It's Margaret," she said, barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, "Are you all right? I'd like to talk legally," Margaret said. About limits, power of attorney, rights of privacy? I see, Julia said slowly. Can you speak freely? Not yet, Margaret murmured. But soon. Julia paused. You're not alone, are you? I'm sitting, Margaret said, but I'm not resting. Just as she ended the call, footsteps approached. Mr. Fletcher Kane, tapping softly, sat beside her, with the care of someone who had learned to take up little space. They write things down, he said, without preamble. Even silence. Margaret turned to him. You mean the staff? He nodded, eyes fixed on the flickering screen ahead. If you skip a pill, they write it. If you don't finish a sentence, they write that too. Have you seen it? I've lived it. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she reached for the armrest beside her. Her fingers touched something hard, something out of place beneath the cushion seam. She slid her hand beneath and felt the faint click of a tiny disc cool against her skin. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smoothed the cushion back into place, leaned back slowly, and crossed her legs. Folded between an old book of poems was something colder than words, a copy of her bank's transfer confirmation. Margaret found it in the library. The shelves smelled of old paper and lemon polish, the air warm and slow. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already slanting weakly through frosted windows. She had wandered in under the pretense of looking for something light to read. Most of the books hadn't been touched in years. She ran her fingers along faded spines until she saw it a copy of The Collected Poems of Mary Oliver, its cover cracked along the edges. Inside, midway through the pages, she felt the weight, a thin, folded envelope, tucked where no bookmark belonged. She looked around. No one else was in the room, except an aide shelving magazines in the corner. Margaret opened the envelope slowly, her hands steady. Inside, a printout. Transfer confirmation. Midwest Union Bank date. 2 days after Gerald's funeral. Amount $148,000. Initiated by Ethan Graham. Method joint account authorization. Approved. She read it once, then again. Also inside a handwritten note on cream paper, unmistakably Julia's. Margaret. This came across my desk. You didn't authorize this. But Ethan did. And it's legal if unopposed. The transfer was timed before probate settled. Unless contested, the funds are considered released. You have 60 days left to file. After that, nothing can be done. Please write to me, or better record everything. Margaret sat down, the book still open in front of her. The world seemed muffled, as if a wall of glass had fallen between her and the present. Ethan had not asked, had not even mentioned it. He had planned this while she was still trying to remember how to fold Gerald's sweaters without crying. She closed the book, hiding the documents inside again, and carried it to the reading table by the corner lamp. There she opened her notebook. She wrote carefully. Step 1, survive quietly. Step 2, watch the staff rotations. Step 3, verify surveillance blind spots. Step 4, write to Jay, but through Fletcher. She underlined that last step twice. The overhead light flickered once, a brief blink, like breath held, then returned to its gentle hum. From the doorway, Mr. Fletcher approached. He held a Sudoku book in one hand, but sat down beside her without pretense. You look like someone who just found the twist at the end of a mystery novel, he said low. Margaret didn't smile. She turned the notebook so only she could see it covering part of the page with her hand. Then she leaned slightly toward him. How fast, she whispered. Can you memorize a floor plan? Margaret waited by the elevator, knowing it wouldn't come. It never did when she needed it. The light above the button blinked red. No sound of cables, no hum of machinery. Just the soft rattle of wind beyond the window at the end of the hallway, where snow pressed against the frosted pane like breath held too long. Fletcher stood beside her, arms crossed over his cardigan. "Told you," he muttered. "This floor might as well be the attic." "I wanted to test it again," she said, "just to be sure." "You're sure now?" Margaret didn't respond. Her eyes flicked to the ceiling corner where a small, dark dome camera pointed down. A slight tilt to the right, just like Fletcher had said. A blind spot when someone stood directly beneath it. Earlier that morning, they had paced the corridor, slowly pretending to admire the wallpaper. Fletcher feigned interest in the decorative light fixtures, while Margaret tested reflections on the polished floor. They found the dead angle near the elevator alcove, a place the camera missed entirely. Margaret had crouched, pretending to adjust her shoe, and whispered, "This is the safest spot." Now standing there again, she felt the stillness differently. Not as confinement, but as possibility. "See that door?" Fletcher nodded toward the far end, painted beige to match the walls. "Emergency exit. Leads down to the back courtyard. Locked, of course." Margaret walked to it. There was no handle, just a keypad. She pressed a few random numbers. Nothing happened. "No code?" she asked. "No one talks about it." "And when they do, they say it's for our protection," Fletcher said. "They call this care. I call it curated captivity." She nodded once, then bent slightly, lifting the corner of the hallway rug with deliberate care. Underneath, she slid a small folded square, a hand-drawn floor plan, sketched neatly arrows marking sightlines and potential gaps. She placed it near the corner of the wall trim, where dust settled easily and cleaning staff rarely touched. It wasn't paranoia. It was preservation. They returned to their rooms without speaking much. The corridor remained empty, save for a janitor's cart left unattended near the elevator. Back inside, Margaret took off her sweater slowly. Her hands were cold. She walked to her desk, intending to add a few notes to the notebook. But something new was waiting. A round tin box sat neatly beside the lamp. The lid was pink and gold, shaped like an old-fashioned bakery gift. On top, a printed card. "For being cooperative this week, with appreciation, SG staff." Margaret didn't move for a long moment. She reached for the tin, lifted the lid. Sugar cookies, lined in wax paper, impeccably arranged. No bite marks, no notes inside, just silence and sweetness. She set the tin down, then reached for her notebook, uncapped her pen. She wrote, "There was a schedule for everything, even when one could breathe fresh air." Margaret stepped through the side door with her laminated pass in hand. The lock clicked behind her, with a softness that felt deliberate. A cold breeze pressed against her scarf as she made her way into the small garden behind the facility, a rectangle of early spring green, bordered by waist-high wooden fences and the faint scent of earth returning to life. 2 benches flanked the path. The roses were bare sticks now, and the fountain in the center was dry. But there was sky, and for the first time in weeks, she felt wind that didn't come filtered through a sealed window. She sat on the far bench, facing the fence. A nurse passed by a few feet away, offering a brief nod before moving on. The air held a silence that wasn't exactly peaceful, more like supervised solitude. Margaret opened the book she'd brought, an old mystery novel, spine cracked and pages thinned with age. Nestled between the middle pages was a tea bag she'd requested earlier. She reached in for it with care. A small slip of waxy paper, folded twice, had been tucked into the edge of the sachet. She glanced up. No one nearby. Unfolding it slowly in her lap, the message read, "Court deadline moved. You have 45 days? J." She closed the book. Behind her, a rustle of steps on gravel. "I like your shoes," said a soft, uncertain voice. Margaret turned. Irene, the silver-haired woman who always seemed a few thoughts behind the present, had shuffled over. She wore mismatched socks and carried a faded doll in her arm, its plastic face long scuffed. Irene Margaret greeted gently. "They let me come out when someone remembers to write it down," Irene said. Today they did. Margaret smiled, but it faded when Irene leaned closer and whispered, "They watch who visits, but not who listens." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, lowering her voice. Irene sat beside her, pulling the doll closer. "They don't know, I remember. But sometimes I do," Irene said, her tone drifting, like how they changed the garden lights. Brighter near the back fence. Not for flowers. No flowers grow there. Margaret touched her hand. "Can you help me? Just tell me what you see. Whisper." Irene's eyes scanned the space, the gentle shuffle of staff near the doors, the wind teasing the leaves. Then she pointed. A young man in a grey uniform knelt near the hedge, trimming quietly. "That's not a gardener," Irene whispered. "That's her nephew." Diane's Margaret asked, barely moving her lips. Irene's eyes twinkled with mischief or memory, it was hard to tell which. "She calls him Michael, but I call him the counter. He counts who talks to whom." The wind stirred again, sharper now. Margaret looked over, watched the man for a long moment. He didn't glance up, didn't pause, but the rhythm of his pruning was too steady, too conscious. She noted the way he lingered near the benches, the way he scanned shoes, hands, eye contact. She folded the message back into the teabag wrapper and slipped it under the bench slat. Behind her, Irene hummed softly a lullaby, perhaps, or a warning in disguise. Tuesdays were for scheduled family calls, but Margaret hadn't received one in weeks. At precisely 2:57 p.m., she stepped into the narrow communications room. It was colder than the rest of the facility, lined with pale green walls and a single long desk that held the fixed telephone. A thin pane of glass separated it from the hallway. The clock on the wall ticked with indifferent precision. The chair creaked as she sat. The folder in her lap contained a form she'd quietly requested 3 days ago, personal communication request. Out of state. She had filled it in slowly, with tidy, cursive, sister, Marianne Evans, Oregon. It was a lie Julia had approved. Nurse Kelly entered a few minutes later. Younger than the others, with warm eyes behind square glasses, she carried a clipboard, but no judgment. "You'd like to place a call today, Margaret, yes?" "Just for a few minutes," Margaret replied. Kelly glanced at the form, then at the laminated policy sheet pinned to the wall. "It's not flagged. So yes, you're within your rights." Margaret offered a thin smile. "Thank you, dear." Kelly turned to prepare the line. Margaret's fingers tapped lightly on her lap, counting each second, as she always did when pretending not to care. The dial tone purred. 3 rings, then Julia speaking. Margaret's voice lowered. "Is this about the will or the account?" Julia responded without missing a beat. "Both. I want it undone. Completely." Julia exhaled, barely audible, like someone who had expected this call, just not this soon. "Then I'll need your signature again," she said calmly. "In person. Within 30 days. Or it becomes permanent, Margaret." Margaret's gaze fell to the form beneath her hand. A faint tear in the edge. A coffee stain from an earlier shift. "I can do 30, she said. A pause. Julia's tone sharpened just enough to cut through the static. "And you must not sign anything else. They hand you not a treatment waiver, not a family proxy, not even a birthday card." "I understand." Julia continued, voice-clipped, professional. "I'll send papers through the same route. Expect them within a week. The rest—" She hesitated. "Depends on what you've already observed." Margaret nodded, forgetting Julia couldn't see her. "Plenty," she whispered. Just then, A soft knock. Kelly entered again, silent in her steps, calm in her movements. Margaret hung up without turning. Kelly stood for a long moment. The clipboard in her hand now rested against her side, forgotten. Finally she spoke. "Ma'am? Who exactly are you?" Margaret looked up. The question wasn't accusing. It wasn't hostile. It was the kind of question a person asks when the facts stop matching the assumptions. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Instead, she picked up the pen on the desk and with deliberate care drew a small check mark on the back of her form near the bottom corner, in ink, so faint it might have been dust. Kelly noticed, but said nothing. The room grew quiet again, save for the sound of the clock ticking behind them. The pen in her hand trembled, not from weakness, but from memory. Margaret sat alone in a room with pale walls and one wide window. Outside, the first green hints of spring flickered in the sunlight. A small vase of silk daisies sat on the table, too pristine to be real. The room was quiet, but not private. It shared a wall with the supervisor's office, and Margaret could hear the faint whir of equipment behind it. Across from her, a manila folder lay open. Diane had placed it there just minutes ago. Her voice had been sugar-soft. "We'll make sure you're taken care of, dear. You just need to sign again for continuity, for clarity. Nothing new, just reassurance." Margaret had nodded, not too eagerly. The folder held 3 forms. The top one bore her name in bold type, and below it, confirmation of family representation and asset delegation. A long title for something that made her hands colder than the room. She picked up the pen, slowly, letting it rest in her fingers, not writing, just remembering. A moment passed. Then Diane smiled, pressed her hand gently on Margaret's shoulder, and said, "I'll get us some coffee. Decaf for you, right?" "Of course," Margaret replied. As soon as the door clicked shut, Margaret moved. From beneath the woven mat, tucked under her chair, she retrieved a second envelope, nearly identical to the one Diane had given her. Kelly had left it there less than an hour ago, her hand brushing Margaret's quietly during the linen change. Now Margaret slid it onto the table, unfolded the pages, and compared the documents side by side. Same format, same headings. But this version bore different content in the fine print. This was the document Julia had prepared, one that restored full legal control to Margaret revoked earlier signatures and triggered automatic notification to the court once processed. She lifted the page from Diane's folder, replaced it with Julia's, then laid her hand flat on top, smoothing it carefully. Then, with a breath held longer than needed, she signed. Her handwriting was steady, controlled, unmistakably hers. She tucked the discarded version into the decoy envelope, folded it again, and slipped it beneath her scarf. When Diane returned, holding 2 paper cups with plastic lids, Margaret was looking out the window, hand resting over the freshly signed page. Diane set the drinks down and leaned over the table, peering at the signature. "You made the right choice," she said, smiling so widely it didn't reach her eyes. Margaret turned back to her gently. "I finally did," she said softly. Diane didn't hear the difference. She picked up the folder, gave a pat to Margaret's hand, and left. Once alone, Margaret let her eyes linger on the empty chair across from her. She'd just bought herself back. Margaret had never been invited to her own birthday since she turned 70. And yet here, she stood beside a table draped in pale yellow linen, the edges fluttering in the soft air of the main hall. A cake sat at the centre, 3-tiered, topped with artificial lilies and a tiny sugar sign. Happy 74th Margaret. Around her, a smattering of chairs, half filled with other residents, some clapping on cue, some blinking in confusion. Diane smiled like a proud host. A little something to celebrate our dear Margaret, always so cooperative, always so graceful. Margaret blinked slowly. Her cardigan matched the tablecloth, her shoes were polished. She had been escorted here without being asked. But she smiled, a soft, measured smile. Thank you. This is unexpected. To her left, a young man with a camera adjusted the lens. It's for our monthly newsletter, Diane said cheerfully. We love showing how well our residents are cared for. Margaret nodded again, as if touched. The camera rolled. A red light blinked. Diane stepped aside. Would you like to say a few words, Margaret? She stood. Her fingers brushed the chair's arm before releasing. A quiet breath. Then, when I turned 50, she began, my late husband gave me a teapot. I told him I wasn't old enough for quiet tea afternoons. He laughed. A few smiles around the room. Margaret continued, voice calm. When I turned 65, my son gave me a diary. Empty pages. He said, "Write what matters, Mum." I never did. I thought I'd wait for something worth writing. Diane's expression flickered only slightly, but Margaret caught it. There, under the makeup and the soft scarf, something sharpened behind her eyes. She knows, Margaret thought. She's read the files. Mr. Fletcher, seated 2 chairs away, leaned slightly toward her. You didn't tell them about the envelope, did you? Margaret turned just enough to meet his eyes. Not yet, she said with a quiet smile. The young cameraman shifted positions. The lens followed her movement. Irene giggled behind her cup of juice and clapped once out of rhythm. A nurse gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. Diane took a step closer. Shall we cut the cake? Margaret turned to the camera instead. Thank you all, she said clearly, eyes on the blinking red light, for watching so closely. The lens didn't blink back, but Diane did. It was sealed with dust, not wax, hidden between cookbooks and forgotten hope. The rain outside whispered against the glass, like an old memory returning home. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, the dim glow of her bedside lamp, casting long shadows across the blanket. Her hands, steadier than they had been in weeks, opened the box with a slow reverence. Inside, time-worn recipe cards, a broken measuring spoon, a folded paper napkin from a birthday past, and between them, an envelope. It was small, its corners frayed. On the front, in her late husband's crisp handwriting, to be opened only if they turn against you. She stared at it, her breath shallow. 5 years. 5 years it had waited untouched. She had forgotten the drawer, the box, even the memory of him slipping this into their home. Or perhaps she had chosen not to remember, not until now. She opened the envelope with the tip of a letter opener, careful not to tear. Inside was a single page, handwritten. Margaret, if you're reading this, then I was right to worry. I knew something was coming. Not from strangers, but from those closest to us. I never wanted to say it out loud. It would have broken you. But I saw the way Diane looked at me, at the house, at the numbers. And Ethan, he's too much his mother's son. I created a secondary will with Julia's help. She insisted I put it through Callum's firm, you remember the one in Traverse City. You'll find proof of our joint ownership. If they've tried to erase you, they've done it illegally. Use this. Take back what's yours. I'm sorry I didn't prepare you better. But I never doubted you could survive anything. Love always, Gerald. Her hands trembled, but her face did not. She reached deeper into the envelope. There, folded beneath the letter, was a photocopy of a sworn declaration signed, dated, notarized. Gerald's signature. Her own. The paper read, joint ownership of estate and all attached accounts, including but not limited to the 12M Trust, filed under account 475XW. She held it to the light. Embossed seal. legible date, a timestamp 5 weeks before Gerald's stroke. It had been real. Margaret exhaled not relief, but recognition. Like a tune she once played on the piano, long forgotten, but suddenly alive again in her fingers. Her eyes drifted toward the window. In the distance across the courtyard, the lamplight near the security station flickered once. Then again. She whispered, "Callum, it's time." Nobody expected the woman in beige to be the one holding the folder that could end it all. The clouds hung low over the suburban skyline, smearing the morning light into grey smudges across the office windows. Margaret stepped through the doorway. Slowly, her coat neatly buttoned her scarf, looped once with care. She carried no purse, only a beige folder in her hand, soft-edged, worn with travel, but firm. The receptionist barely looked up before murmuring, "Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Second door to the left." The hallway smelled faintly of old books and pinewood polish. Margaret let her fingers trail briefly along the ridged panelling, not out of hesitation, but memory. She hadn't been here in years, not since Gerald had insisted on that meeting with a quiet lawyer, not one of those loud ones downtown. Callum Hayes was waiting in a leather chair by the window, a pair of reading glasses perched low on his nose. Older now, yes, slower to stand, but his eyes sharpened the moment he saw her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with a nod. "Or, would you prefer Margaret?" She replied, offering a small smile. "And you haven't changed much, Mr. Hayes. That's what they all say. Until I try to remember where I left my coffee." She chuckled gently, then handed him the beige folder. "I need to know if this still means anything." He opened it carefully. No rush, no reaction. Just the hum of his breath as he read the first line. His fingers paused on Gerald's signature. Then, without a word, he reached behind his desk and pulled open a small safe embedded in the wall. A worn black envelope emerged, still sealed with wax and bearing Gerald's initials. Callum set both the envelope and Margaret's copy side by side. "Your husband left this here," he said softly, under one condition. "I was not to open it unless someone, most likely you, came in asking whether you were still part of the legacy." His words, not mine. Margaret said nothing. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. With deliberate care, Callum broke the seal. The contents matched line for line. The co-ownership of the estate. The contingency clause if any family member moved to remove Margaret from decision-making roles. The mention of Julia as the executor in case of conflict. Even the language was identical, precise, unmistakable. He sat back. "This is as valid as the day it was signed." As if on cue, Margaret's phone buzzed. She turned it gently speaker on. Julia's voice came through clear and certain. "The $12 million trust account under 475XW still active, still jointly held. No legal transfer out without a dual signature. So unless Margaret consented, and I know she didn't, the prior claim can be voided." Callum exhaled slowly, folding his hands. "If you wish, we can file this before the end of the week. Quietly. Or publicly. Your call." Margaret's lips curved, not a smile of triumph, but one of quiet preparation. "Let them send another birthday invitation," she said. "I'll bring cake and truth." Everyone expected a will reading. No one expected her to show up. The conference room on the top floor was bathed in soft sunlight, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the quiet stretch of downtown. A pitcher of lemon water sat untouched at the center of the long oak table. Around it, the faces were arranged with careful anticipation, composed, expectant, certain. Diane sat at the head of the table, wearing a navy blouse and a thin string of pearls. She cleared her throat delicately. "We're here today to honor Gerald's wishes," she began. My late husband made several decisions in his final year to ensure our family's future would be stable. That includes Margaret's long-term care, something she has agreed to with grace, and the equitable distribution of the estate. She nodded toward Ethan, who stood and opened a folder. My mother, he said, has been clear that she wants what's best for everyone. The ranch property accounts and business holdings will be placed under Diane's stewardship. I'll retain oversight of operations with a portion designated for eventual inheritance by Noah. The lawyer beside them, a young man with smooth hair and smoother shoes, simply smiled and nodded. Everything was progressing as planned, until the door opened. The hinges did not creak, but the silence inside made it feel thunderous. Margaret stepped through beige coat neutral expression, a slim folder in her hands. Behind her came Mr. Fletcher, upright and quiet, carrying nothing but a calm presence. No one spoke. No one needed to. She walked to the table, set the folder down with precision, and took the empty chair at the far end, once considered symbolic, now reclaimed. She slid the folder across the table. The young lawyer picked it up, opened it, and began reading. 2 pages in his brow furrowed. 3 pages, and his smile vanished. By the 5th, he closed the folder and said nothing. Diane leaned forward. Is this some sort of misunderstanding? Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Fletcher. Would you care to read it for them? She said softly. Your voice is steadier. Fletcher stood, pulled the final page from the folder, and read aloud. By this letter, I confirm that Margaret Whitmore is not only of sound mind, but the sole surviving co-owner of the estate known as Silver Hollow, including all financial assets and associated trusts therein. Any action taken to diminish or divert her authority, including those made under assumed guardianship, is rendered invalid. He looked up. Signed Callum Hayes. Dated and notarized. Filed. Silence fell like snow. Ethan's voice cracked. You're cutting me out. Margaret looked at him not with anger, but something far heavier. No, she said. You did that part yourself 5 years ago. Margaret stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on the chair that used to hold so many arguments and so much silence. The late afternoon sun poured softly through the windows of the old house, dust particles dancing lazily in the light. The air smelled faintly of closed-up wood and spring air sneaking in through imperfect seals. Everything was still untouched, as if the house had held its breath for her return. She didn't knock. There was no need. The keys still worked, though the lock resisted briefly, as if uncertain whether to let her in. Inside the living room looked just as it had the day she left. The armchair, Gerald's chair, sat across from the fireplace, slightly tilted, as if he had just stepped away for a moment. A photo of the ranch taken years ago hung crooked above the mantel. Margaret straightened it with one gentle touch. She didn't come to reclaim anything. Not this time. She walked slowly through each room, pausing at the hallway mirror, where her reflection stood both familiar and changed. She passed the dining table where birthdays had once been loud and full, now quiet and dust-lined. In the kitchen, the clock had stopped months ago. On the front stoop, a white envelope waited in the rusted mailbox. No name, just one word in neat cursive piece. Inside a card signed by Diane. A note that said, I won't contest anything. Do what you need to do? Margaret placed it on the entryway table unopened. The screen door creaked once behind her. Margaret, came a soft voice. She turned to see Ida, her old neighbour, standing with 2 cups of tea on a small tray. Her silver hair was pinned back, as always, her shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders. I figured you'd stop by, Ida said. Didn't figure you'd knock. They sat together on the porch steps, sipping in silence. The garden was overgrown. The hydrangeas would bloom soon, but today they bowed under their own weight. I kept looking at that window, Ida said, nodding toward the living room. Wondered when you'd look back through it. Margaret smiled faintly. I used to think silence was punishment, she said. Now I know. It can be peace. The sky shifted to gold. A few birds settled into the trees. No more speeches, no more documents, no final arguments. Margaret stood, walked back inside, and placed the house keys gently on the kitchen table next to the dusty salt shaker and a folded napkin with her initials. Let's leave it as it is, she whispered. Let time own it now. She didn't close the door behind her. She didn't have to. The lawyer asked, Are you sure you want to proceed this way? Margaret didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The notary office was quiet, smaller than expected, with frosted windows and a single ticking wall clock. The air smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. A breeze stirred the curtains just enough to remind her that outside the world kept turning. She sat down at the table where the young associate from Callum's firm waited pen in hand, papers neatly aligned. No cameras, no family, no witnesses except the law and her signature. He pushed the folder gently toward her. Take your time. But she didn't need time. She read through each line again, carefully, eyes steady. The pages bore no bitterness, only clarity. At the center, her granddaughter's name. To Eleanor Bloom, currently aged 12, I leave what I was never given at that age, a chance to decide, freely speak clearly, and be believed. She paused at the next section. A small paragraph, fewer than 20 words, but it had taken her decades to be ready to write them. To my son, I leave the lesson I learned too late, that silence is not agreement. The lawyer looked up. Would you like to add a note? Margaret shook her head. That line says everything. She signed. One signature, then another, then a soft click of the seal. It was done. She stood, collected her coat, and nodded politely. Please send the copy to Mr. Ethan Bloom. No cover letter. No delay. The lawyer hesitated, understood. Outside, the day had warmed. Early spring sunlight filtered through the park trees across the street. Margaret crossed slowly, savouring each step. A child's laughter rang out. A girl ran past her on the path, ponytail bouncing. Grandma the child called to someone else, not her, but Margaret still smiled. She didn't need forgiveness. She had freedom. She walked further into the trees, her coat light on her shoulders, the wind kinder than before. No one followed. No one asked for her to explain. Later that day, at a house in a different part of town, Ethan opened an envelope from an unfamiliar firm. There was no letter, no introduction, just the document. At the bottom, in clean print, effective immediately. She walked away from the house without locking the door, not because she forgot, but because she no longer needed to protect what was rightfully hers. After years of silence and subtle erasure, Margaret reclaimed not just her name on a document, but her voice in a world that tried to quiet her. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it settles like dust on a forgotten chair, inevitable, unshakable, and final. Sometimes it only takes one steady woman to remind the world that dignity is not negotiable. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.